Right now, exactly one human species exists on Earth. That has not always been true. For most of human history, several species existed at the same time, sometimes on the very same continent. What happened to the others did not happen the way you would guess. For 2.5 million years, the ground under your feet could have held more than one kind of human. Different height, different face, different way of solving the same problem. That crowd did not thin out in a single afternoon, a single war, or a single winning trait. It thinned out one species at a time, for reasons that barely resemble each other. Some of those other humans stood taller than you. Others barely reached your chest. Some carried brains bigger than yours. At least one got by with a brain a third the size. None of them knew they were being timed. You call this planet crowded now, home to more than 8 billion people. It was crowded in a different way, for almost the entire time humans have existed, not with strangers who looked like you, with entirely different branches of the same family tree. Somewhere on that same ground, another kind of human was living an entirely ordinary day. Hunting, resting, teaching a child how to strike stone into an edge. The easy assumption is that Homo sapiens did it. It hunted every rival into extinction, one branch after another, until only the winner was left standing. So is that actually what happened to the other species that disappeared? For most of them, it is simply not the story. That instinct isn't unreasonable. Homo sapiens has, at times, outcompeted and even absorbed other populations it met. But treating that as the explanation for every disappearance flattens each of these very different endings into one convenient villain. Take Homo erectus, the longest surviving human species on record. In 2019, geochronologist Kira Westaway's team dated the species' last known fossils. They came from Ngandong, on Java's Solo River, and were between 117,000 and 108,000 years old. That means Homo erectus lasted nearly 2 million years, more than 6 times as long as Homo sapiens has existed so far. Nothing hunted it into extinction. The open woodland it depended on turned into closed rainforest, and the animals it had always eaten left with the shifting climate. There was no predator, no rival, and no single bad day to blame. The landscape it was built for simply stopped existing. A species that endured on 3 continents, through ice ages and warm periods alike, was undone by nothing more dramatic than trees closing overhead. 2 million years is long enough for the African savanna to become unrecognizable more than once. It is long enough for oceans to rise and fall, and for mountain ranges to finish forming. Homo erectus outlasted all of it, until it simply couldn't anymore. If a species this dominant could vanish without a single enemy, the others deserve attention too. Subscribe now. This is only the first one. The rest disappeared for different reasons, and only one of those reasons has much to do with us at all. One starved when an island dried up. One left behind almost nothing but a single strand of DNA. One is so strange that researchers still argue about what it proves. Erectus, though, is nowhere close to the oldest of these species. Rewind another 500,000 years into East Africa, and the family gets its very first name. Around 2.4 million years ago, someone in East Africa picked up a rock and struck it against another until an edge appeared. The maker stood under 1.5 meters tall, with a brain roughly a third the size of a modern human's. Scientists named the species Homo habilis, handyman, for exactly that habit. Tools have since turned up elsewhere, dated 700,000 years earlier, made by someone still unidentified. Whoever struck the first edge, habilis was not working alone for long. Habilis and erectus both belong to the family's opening chapters. Neanderthals belong to a much later one. They evolved in Europe's Ice Age cold, hundreds of thousands of years after Erectus first walked out of Africa. Neanderthals had brains slightly larger than ours, on average. Their bodies were built for cold. Broad chests, thick bones, strong arms, and wide noses to warm freezing air before it reached the lungs. They buried their dead. They hunted animals many times their own size, at close range. That habit left a pattern of injuries once compared to those of modern rodeo riders, a comparison since challenged. For decades, everyone assumed Neanderthals simply vanished into the cold around 40,000 years ago. The genetics tell a far more specific story. In 2022, geneticist Svante Pääbo won a Nobel Prize for recovering a working genome from Neanderthal bones more than 40,000 years old. His own institute celebrates Nobel wins with a very specific tradition, throwing the winner into a pond. Later studies narrowed the story further. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens interbred for roughly 7,000 years, starting around 50,500 years ago. That window lasted until Neanderthals began to disappear. That is why people with non-African ancestry carry about 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA today. But whole stretches of the modern human genome are almost empty of Neanderthal genes. Geneticists call them deserts. Those particular combinations turned out to be harmful and were quietly weeded out within about 100 generations. In a cave called Chagirskaya in Siberia, a 2022 study sequenced 13 Neanderthals from one small community. 2 of them turned out to be a father and his daughter. That's a close blood relationship found by chance inside a sample of just 13 people. In a large, mixed population, finding 2 direct relatives like that in such a small sample would be a huge coincidence. Here, it wasn't. It was a sign of exactly how small and inbred this particular community really was. Neanderthals at least left a face and a skeleton to reconstruct. The Denisovans left almost nothing. The species takes its name from Denisova Cave in Siberia. In 2010, a DNA sequence from a single child's finger bone matched no known human. A second clue sat unrecognized for decades before anyone understood what it was. In the 1980s, a monk had found a jawbone at Baishia Karst Cave, a Tibetan Buddhist site, high on the Tibetan plateau. That was years before anyone even knew what a Denisovan was. A team led by Dongju Zheng finally confirmed, through protein analysis in 2019, that the jaw belonged to one. A rib bone from the same cave was later dated to between 48,000 and 32,000 years ago. Denisovans may still have been there as Homo sapiens spread across Asia. Why they vanished is unclear, though many suspect small groups were simply absorbed into arriving populations. Today, Melanesians and Aboriginal Australians carry up to roughly 5% Denisovan DNA, the highest archaic ancestry of any living population. Tibetans carry something more specific, a gene called EPAS1, inherited from Denisovans, that helps the body use oxygen efficiently at high altitude. People walking the Himalaya today are, in a very literal sense, breathing with borrowed lungs. Not every one of these species vanished from a shrinking habitat. Some lived on islands and evolved in the opposite direction, smaller, not taller. In 2003, on the Indonesian island of Flores, archaeologists uncovered a skeleton just over a meter tall. Its skull was small enough to fit in 2 cupped hands. They named it Homo floresiensis. The press, less formally, called it the Hobbit. How its ancestors even reached the island remains its own mystery. Tools there date back 900,000 years, which implies bamboo rafts crossed open water before any known boat existed. It hunted stegodon, a dwarf elephant relative that had itself shrunk to fit the island's limited resources. Biologists call that pattern island dwarfism. Big species shrink where food is scarce and predators are absent, while small ones grow. The same rule produced giant rats, a person-sized stork, and 3-meter Komodo dragons, sharing the island with a human barely over a meter tall. Revised dating now places the skeleton between 100,000 and 60,000 years old, with stone tools persisting until around 50,000. Long blamed on Homo sapiens arriving, the extinction now looks different. A 2025 study found that rainfall around Liangbua dropped sharply, and rivers ran dry. The local stegodon population collapsed around 61,000 years ago. On an island this small, no global catastrophe was needed. A shrinking water supply and vanishing food were already enough. Homo floresiensis appears to have followed its food source into extinction, with no evidence that Homo sapiens was ever at the scene. If Floresiensis shrank to fit an island, Homo naledi is stranger still. It had a small brain and curved fingers that, at first glance, looked like something from the deep past. The remains were found in 2013, deep inside the Rising Star cave system near Johannesburg. The chamber was reachable only through a vertical chute barely 18 centimeters wide. Lee Berger, the paleoanthropologist leading the dig, recruited a team small enough to fit through a Facebook call. Nearly 60 people applied. Berger picked 6 women, later nicknamed the Underground Astronauts. They squeezed through a passage called Superman's Crawl and climbed a rock face called the Dragon's Back to reach the fossils. Berger himself was too large to fit. It took him 8 years of losing weight to follow his own team down. The dig recovered more than 1,500 fossil fragments from at least 15 individuals, a brain about a third the size of ours. Most researchers guessed it was well over 1 million years old. Dating published in 2017 proved them wrong. The fossils were between 236,000 and 335,000 years old. That means Homo naledi was alive at roughly the same time as the earliest Homo sapiens. Berger's team went further, arguing the chamber shows deliberate burial and engraved wall markings behavior assumed to be uniquely ours. Other paleoanthropologists remain unconvinced. A 2023 review called the evidence too thin. One more detail from 2026 deepens the puzzle. Protein analysis of the teeth suggests every individual tested from the chamber was female. Nobody yet knows why. More than 11,000 kilometers from South Africa, in the Philippines, a very different cousin turned up almost by accident. In 2007, archaeologist Armand Mijares was excavating Calao Cave on Luzon when his team pulled a single foot bone from the sediment. 12 years passed, along with the discovery of several teeth, finger bones, and part of a thigh bone. Only then did the team feel confident enough to name a new species, Homo luzonensis, dated to between 67,000 and 50,000 years ago. Its teeth are small and simple, closer to a modern human's than to anything archaic. Its toe bone tells a different story. It is curved and grasping, almost identical to that of Australopithecus extinct in Africa for nearly 3 million years. Paleoanthropologist Florent Detroit, who co-led the study, said the combination matched no other known Homo. One leading explanation: a population of Homo erectus reached Luzon far earlier, then evolved in isolation for hundreds of thousands of years. It kept some primitive features while modernizing others, almost at random. While all of this was happening, across 3 different continents, our own species was quietly taking shape in Africa. For decades, the oldest confirmed Homo sapiens fossils came from Ethiopia, dated to roughly 195,000 years ago. That changed in 2017, when Jean-Jacques Hublin's team re-examined a long-overlooked site in Morocco called Jebel Irhoud. New dating placed the fossils a skull, jaws, teeth, and limb bones from 5 people. They were between 300,000 and 350,000 years old. That is 100,000 years older than any previous find. The remains combined a modern-looking face with a more old-fashioned brain case, evidence of a species still mid-transformation. An interbreeding population was already spread across much of Africa. The Sahara was green and passable then, not the desert it is now. From there, Homo sapiens expanded outward across deserts and coastlines, eventually reaching every continent except Antarctica, meeting people who were already there. Sometimes there was conflict, sometimes interbreeding. Sometimes one group simply outcompeted the other for the same land. Your own species started exactly the same way every other one did. Unfinished, regional, one changeable population among several with no sign yet that it would be the one still standing. Open your own genome today, and the unfinished part is still there. There is a % or 2 of Neanderthal DNA if your ancestors ever left Africa. There is a gene borrowed from Denisovans if your ancestors ever settled at high altitude. And scattered through the rest of it are long deserts where those same borrowed genes were quietly deleted because they never worked. You did not choose any of it, and you will never feel it happening. None of that explains why Homo sapiens made it this far in the first place. Why exactly Homo sapiens survived, when species just as capable did not, is still an open question. The Neanderthal case is currently the best tested clue available. What decided which of two nearly identical species would survive, and which would leave nothing but a genome pulled from broken bone? In 2026, anthropologist Ariane Burke at the Université de Montréal proposed an answer. Her team adapted population models normally used to track animals and plants. Models like these are more often used to predict which small, isolated wildlife populations are the first to disappear. Homo sapiens groups, they found, sat inside denser, more connected networks than Neanderthal groups did, particularly toward the east. That community at Chagirskaya was small enough to catch a father and his daughter in the very same sample. It is exactly the kind of isolation her models flag as dangerous. That kind of network worked like insurance against a hard winter or a failed hunt. The two species barely competed directly, overlapping in less than 5% of the land either one used. Climate alone does not explain the extinction either, since Neanderthals had already survived worse ice ages. What seems to have mattered most was which species could fall back on a wider circle when the ground gave way. Others point to raw adaptability instead. The adaptability camp points to something broader. Across new environments, Homo sapiens changed diet, tools, and shelter fast, sometimes within a single generation. Neanderthal toolkits, by comparison, changed far more slowly across the same kind of pressure. A minority view holds the deciding factor was more direct, competition or outright conflict. The competitive exclusion camp points to the rare places where the two species' territories genuinely overlapped. Even occasional direct contact, they argue, could tip an already fragile population toward collapse. None of these is proven on its own. Most researchers suspect the real answer braids more than one of them together, differing from one continent to the next. That braided answer is less satisfying than a single cause, but it matches how extinction seems to work across this whole list. Even Burke is careful about the limits of her own model. It explains a pattern across most sites, not the fate of any single group. That kind of caution is rare in a field that used to prefer tidy single-cause stories. One bigger brain, one better weapon, one decisive winter. The honest picture is messier, and probably always will be. That is not a failure of the science. It is what real science sounds like this early into the story. The same honesty applies to Homo naledi's all-female chamber mentioned earlier. Nobody has a confirmed explanation for that either, and the researchers who found it say so plainly. What is not in question is what got left behind. Homo erectus survived nearly 2 million years and still lost the one climate it was built for. Naledi and Luzonensis are recent additions to the family tree, and they are already rewriting the textbooks. Denisovans are still mostly a rumor with excellent DNA. You are not a finished design. You are an edited draft, assembled from pieces of species that no longer exist to take credit for it. 8 human lineages have been identified so far. 7 of them are gone. None of the 7 vanished for being the weakest in the room. What did them in was bad geography, bad timing, or a body that stopped fitting the world. The 8th is still standing on the same ground, in the same crowd it once shared with all the others. You are the only one left to tell it. If this changed how you see your own species, subscribe and hit like. Then tell us in the comments which of the 8 surprised you most.